What if tomorrow the world suddenly lost access to new oil for 30 days? Not because the oil disappeared. Not because every gas station instantly went dry. The oil already inside tanks, pipelines, refineries, airports, and ships would still be there. And that is what makes the first few days so strange. Cars would keep moving, planes would still fly, trucks would still deliver food. For a while, almost everything would look normal. But behind that normality, one number would be falling every hour. The amount of usable fuel left in the system. And then governments, airlines, hospitals, factories, farmers, and ordinary drivers would face the same problem. Who gets the fuel that's left? Because a 30-day oil shortage wouldn't begin by stopping the world. It would begin by forcing the world to decide what is important enough to keep moving. And once those choices begin, the real question isn't simply what happens when the oil runs out. It's what happens to everything the oil was keeping alive. The first few hours would be surprisingly ordinary. There would be no global alarm, no sudden silence across the highways. Most people would wake up, start their cars, and go to work using fuel that was already inside the system. At a fuel station, a driver might fill the tank without realizing that the fuel being pumped could be among the last supplies that station receives for weeks. Airports would keep operating, trucks would keep moving, ships already at sea would continue their journeys. That existing fuel is what buys the world time. But every gallon being burned would be a gallon that couldn't be replaced. Behind the scenes, fuel terminals would begin tracking inventories more closely. Airlines would calculate how many flights they could safely operate. Trucking companies would start protecting diesel for essential routes. And governments would face a decision that sounds simple until millions of people depend on the answer. Who gets the fuel first? Hospitals need ambulances, farmers need machinery, supermarkets need deliveries, emergency services need vehicles. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary drivers still need to get to work. The world wouldn't have run out of fuel yet. It would have something more subtle, a rapidly shrinking margin for error. And once that margin begins disappearing, every decision becomes harder. By the second and third day, the first real change would appear. Fuel would stop being treated like an ordinary product. Governments could prioritize emergency services, companies could protect supplies for critical operations, airlines could cut routes, fuel distributors could limit who receives what. That might keep the most important systems moving. But it would create a new problem. Someone else has to move everything those systems need. A hospital can protect its ambulances, but it still depends on deliveries. A supermarket can keep its doors open, but its shelves depend on trucks arriving from warehouses. A factory can reserve fuel for its machinery, but production still requires materials arriving from somewhere else. At a distribution center, a manager might have enough stock for several days, but no certainty about when the next shipment will arrive. The shortage would begin moving outward. Not because every vehicle has stopped. Because fewer vehicles can be used for everything at once. A delivery that once arrived every day might arrive every few days. A company that normally keeps only a small inventory would suddenly discover how quickly that inventory disappears. And this is the first major shift in the crisis. The world wouldn't simply be running short of fuel. It would be running short of reliable movement. Once transportation becomes selective, the question changes from how much fuel is left to something much harder. What are we willing to stop moving? By the end of the first week, the shortage would reach a place most people rarely connect with: oil. Production itself. A factory doesn't only need fuel to move its trucks. It needs a steady flow of parts, chemicals, packaging, raw materials, and workers. When transportation becomes unreliable, factories start making a difficult calculation. Do they keep producing with the materials they have? Or slow down now, before those materials run out completely? A factory manager might look at a warehouse that still appears full and realize that the next shipment has no reliable arrival date. Stopping early could protect what remains. Continuing could keep workers employed, but leave nothing to work with later. Some would reduce shifts, others would postpone production. Businesses with very little inventory would feel the pressure first. Agriculture would face its own version of the problem. A tractor doesn't care whether diesel is expensive or scarce. Without fuel, it cannot plant, harvest, or move a crop. And this creates a strange paradox. The world could conserve fuel by driving less, flying less, and producing less. That would stretch the remaining supply. But the same slowdown would reduce the goods and services that fuel was helping the economy produce. So the crisis would begin feeding itself. Using less oil would protect the remaining system, but using less oil would also make that system smaller. And now the most important resource would no longer be fuel alone. It would be time. How long could factories, farms, hospitals, and cities keep operating before their remaining supplies reached the point where conservation was no longer enough? By the second week, the crisis would become a problem of priorities. There simply wouldn't be enough fuel to keep every part of the economy operating normally, so governments and companies would have to decide what stays moving and what doesn't. Emergency services would come first. Food distribution, hospitals, public transport, and other critical operations would compete for protected supplies. But protecting one system can weaken another. Keep more fuel going to public transport, and fewer deliveries may reach businesses. Protect food distribution, and some industrial operations may have to slow down. Reserve fuel for agriculture, and other sectors may receive less. There would be no perfect allocation. And ordinary people would begin noticing those choices. A bus might run less often. A worker might struggle to reach a job that still exists. A construction project might pause because equipment or materials cannot arrive. Meanwhile, a hospital logistics team could be watching its remaining supplies, while knowing that the next delivery may not arrive on its usual schedule. The strange part is that society could still be functioning. The lights could still be on, shops could still be open, cars could still be moving. But the normal rhythm would be disappearing. And by the third week, the biggest danger would no longer be simply having less fuel. It would be having a system that has been forced to operate differently for so long that restarting it becomes a problem of its own. By the third and fourth week, the world would have learned to live with less. Flights would remain restricted. Some factories would still be operating below capacity. Transport would be focused on the most important routes. And that adaptation would reveal something unexpected. The world is more flexible than it looks. People can travel less. Companies can combine deliveries. Governments can prioritize essential services. Businesses can find ways to stretch limited inventories. But every workaround creates another delay somewhere else. A delayed shipment can mean a delayed production run. A postponed maintenance job can leave equipment unavailable longer. A disrupted agricultural schedule can affect what happens months later. And this is where the 30-day scenario becomes more revealing. The damage isn't measured only by how much fuel was consumed. It's measured by how many systems fell out of sync while trying to conserve it. Then, on day 30, new oil finally begins flowing again. The immediate crisis would ease. But the system wouldn't instantly return to normal. Fuel inventories would need to be rebuilt. Ships and trucks would have to catch up on delayed routes. Factories would need to replace missing materials. Businesses would be trying to recover from weeks of reduced activity at the same time. The oil would be back. The synchronization would not. And that is what makes 30 days without new oil so revealing. The world wouldn't discover that modern life needs oil. It would discover how much of modern life depends on oil arriving on time.